A terrifying emergency announcement reverberated through the royal hallways just 5 minutes ago. Normally calm and collected, Princess Anne and Princess Catherine showed up side by side to reveal a catastrophe directly related to Meghan Markle. However, this was not your typical scandal. It was the result of months of covertly developing layers of deceit that culminated in a full-fledged royal emergency. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss any updates before we delve further into what this actually implies for the royal family. It started with a fleeting yet startling sighting outside Clarence's house. Cameras rushed to record the event as Princess Anne stood next to a clearly distressed Princess Catherine, projecting her signature forceful yet composed demeanor. Together, they spoke to a press horde with the solemnity usually associated with national crises. It was a clipped tone. Their words were purposeful, but what really affected the country was not what they said, but rather what they didn't say. They warned of irreparable repercussions and discussed how royal integrity was being compromised. There were no names mentioned. The implication, however, was overwhelming. The crisis was personal and internal. It also had a name. The senior royal, Meghan Markle, was supposedly misled for months, some even claimed years, by material that now seems to be blatantly untrue. Although the whole scope of the deception was not made clear, Anne's expression spoke for itself. Family conflicts were no longer the focus of this. The monarchy's legitimacy was directly threatened. The decision to make this statement was not taken lightly, according to people close to the palace. Actually, it was the result of a fierce internal conflict that persisted all night. A few assistants pleaded for moderation, requesting that the royals deal with the issue in private. However, Catherine and Anne had had enough. They felt that their silence had simply made it easier for the lies to proliferate. The public now needed to be aware that a terrible thing had happened. The last straw, according to insiders, was a classified document Meghan allegedly gave to legal teams that included information about her foundation and conflicted with royal documents already in existence. It was evident that a boundary had been crossed when Anne and Catherine compared those assertions. Additionally, once crossed, there would be no going back. However, the palace is still keeping quiet about the entire scope of the findings. All that was made public were cryptic language and sinister clues, not enough to provide clarity, but enough to spark conjecture. Certainly that was a strategy. A notification to Meghan indicating they were observing, recording, and ready to take action. The public's reaction has been swift and forceful. Within minutes, social media was in full swing. Royal pundits are speculating about the nature of the emergency. Was there a leak, a lie, an act of the highest betrayal? Everyone feels that this is only the beginning, but no one is positive, because this was not your typical press release. The explosion was managed, one that caused the world to demand answers and the monarchy to shudder. We need to go back to the discreet disintegration that started weeks ago behind closed doors in order to comprehend how the palace came to this boiling point. Although the royal family has traditionally remained silent when faced with controversy, they were no longer shielded by quiet this time. Beneath the solemn faces of Anne and Catherine is a secret. Meghan's own network of deceit has gradually spread throughout the ranks of the palace, causing discord, perplexity, and treachery. Quietly, it started. Catherine noticed something uncomfortable while the public was preoccupied with extravagant ceremonies and well-planned appearances. There are a few little discrepancies hidden deep in royal records. A signature here, a date there. She initially believed it to be an administrative error. However, the fabric started to rip as she tugged at the loose thread. She found inconsistent records that were directly related to Meghan's assertions by cross-referencing schedules, private notes, and archive entries. Some of these records had already influenced how the public perceived royal events. It became increasingly evident as Catherine dug deeper. It wasn't a coincidence. Important dates pertaining to personal invites, royal activities, and even financial declarations have been discreetly changed to Meghan's advantage. But it was more than just internal documents. Stolen emails, some of which were anonymously shared on private message boards, suggested that Meghan and a select group of advisors from outside the UK were working together covertly. Despite their cautious wording and frequent ambiguity, these emails provided an unsettling image of long-term strategy and influence. When Catherine realized the consequences, she turned to Princess Anne, the only other royal recognized for her unwavering devotion to duty. Anne didn't hesitate like others did. Using handwritten notes, calendar access logs, and private correspondence, she started putting together a secret timeline. However, when she discreetly tried to warn Camilla and King Charles, her worries were quickly rejected. According to reports, Charles called the affair a sad misunderstanding. Camilla, on the other hand, is reported to have advised moderation, stressing optics over escalation. That choice would turn out to be expensive. Anne and Catherine were forced to labor in the background since the palace's leadership was unwilling to take action. New levels of suspicion and discrepancies emerged every week. Meghan's requests for private encounters with foreign dignitaries, her timing of visits to undermine official royal messaging, her strategic posture during important events, and her illegal revisions of press releases were all the subject of rumors. The illusion of oneness started to crumble gradually. Employees inside the royal household began to pick sides. While some tended towards silence out of charm or intimidation, others stuck to procedure. Trust quickly deteriorated. Nevertheless, the populace continued to be unaware, only being exposed to the polished story that the royal apparatus presented. However, Catherine was aware of the disastrous consequences if the basis of the monarchy was based on fabricated stories. Family was no longer a factor in this. It had to do with the crown itself. Anne and she realized they could not wait any longer. In royal history, the lies were not merely whispered. They were recorded, sealed, and stamped. A perilous hush spread within the inner group, particularly between William and Charles, as the lines of dishonesty became more apparent. Prince William's rage was cold rather than loud. Insiders spoke of a prince who felt deceived by his own family's reluctance to take action, as well as by Meghan. William delivered a grim warning as the impact of the lies became clear. The monarchy might not recover if this is made public without our reaction. For weeks it had been building. Ever the obedient heir, William had initially kept his worries to himself. But when more inconsistencies emerged as a result of Catherine and Anne's persistent investigation, his tolerance ran out. Instead of making a token gesture, he asked for a thorough internal assessment that included staff interviews, archived events, and access to confidential correspondence. He was looking for clarification, not confidence. Rather, he encountered opposition. According to reports, Camilla, who was worried about appearances, cautioned that any official investigation might cause a lot of problems. William was pushed to let it go by a number of senior advisors who were still committed to the unity image. They asserted that facing Meghan would just strengthen her story, that the backlash wasn't worth it, and that public memory would wane. William, however, saw right through it. This was not a drama to him. The crown's survival and the truth were at stake here. A private meeting at Sandringham was the tipping point. William met his father head-on in a room filled with royal tension. He presented the facts, the chronology, and the impact. But Charles, ever cautious, was hesitant to take decisive action. He was afraid of scandal. He was afraid of being divided. Maybe more than anything else, he was afraid of the emotional consequences that might ensue. It was a short but deadly argument. They exchanged words that had never been spoken before. William allegedly walked out of the room without even bowing. A voicemail was leaked shortly after. William was heard conversing with an unidentified confidant on the muffled recording, which was obviously not meant for public consumption. Exhaustion cracked in his voice. They were aware. "Oh," he said. The signs were visible to them. And they continued to do nothing. It was the voice of a future monarch who was not only furious, but also profoundly hurt. Catherine never wavered in her resolve. She supported her husband with unshakable clarity, even if many questioned the logic of intensifying the situation. She was aware that silence has a price. She had already paid for it with headlines, rumors, and subtle charges against her family and character. She had had enough of William carrying it by himself. The mood changed within Buckingham Palace. Advisors became divided into groups. William's demand for openness was endorsed by several. Others called for silence and damage control. But it was now impossible to refute. This could no longer be handled. It was flammable. Nevertheless, Anne observed in silence amidst all the turmoil. She had already gathered the necessary items on her own. Preparing for the next move. Anne was getting ready to act as the palace argued, and William raged. Because sometimes you take action without waiting for authorization in order to defend the crown. However, Princess Anne's action converted rumors into conflict just as tensions appeared to be at their highest. Seldom does Anne, the silent enforcer of the palace, come into view. This time, however, she did more than just talk. She made a demand. She presented sealed evidence with a chilling ultimatum to King Charles during an urgent meeting. "I'll take action if you don't." The gloves had just been removed by the last line of discipline in the monarchy. Anne had spent too much time observing. She had watched silently as Meghan's power grew and her lies proliferated in both royal records and journalistic accounts. However, Anne was not motivated by emotion or ego. Duty was what motivated her. She also doesn't hesitate when her duty is in danger. She collected the receipts over several weeks. Falsified guest lists, altered itineraries, internal contradictions, private conversations, and manipulated messaging. The allegations ranged from modest to startlingly audacious. All, however, indicated the same reality. Meghan had changed the story of the palace to fit her own. Anne put together a thorough, almost surgical dossier. All of the documents were compared. Each quote is supported by evidence that has been time-stamped. Even though Catherine had discovered the initial discrepancies, Anne was the one who made the pieces into a weapon that was too potent to ignore. She acted without waiting for approval. Anne marched directly into King Charles's private study, avoiding both private secretaries and royal courtiers. Not a warning. Don't wait. She placed the file on his desk as soon as she entered and made it obvious. The institution itself was in peril because of the extent of the lies. She would also go public with or without Charles's permission if he did nothing to preserve the family name. As always, when tensions in the palace started to flare, Camilla tried to step in. This time, however, her voice was powerless. Anne's was more measured and louder, but it was tinged with a thunder that hadn't been heard in decades in the palace. She reminded them of her discipline record, her lifetime of service, and her avoidance of drama. They had all waited too long if she was now moving forward. Anne posed an institutional threat in addition to a personal one. Citing irreconcilable ethical problems, she threatened to resign from her public royal duties unless prompt action was done to address the narrative and rectify the record. That would rock the Commonwealth to its core for a senior royal like Anne. The world would know that something had gone horribly wrong at Buckingham Palace. Catherine stood silently in sympathy behind the scenes. She gave Anne access to private correspondence that had not yet been made public, classified notes, and private cross-checks. The two women combined to become an unstoppable force for the monarchy. Anne and Catherine braced themselves for impact as others muttered about damage management. It was a time of reckoning for Charles. Let the crown burn slowly from within, or face the flames immediately. He would shortly make the choice. However, fate had other ideas, as it often does in the royal household, because a second voice, weaker but no less, spoke up just as Anne adopted her most audacious stance, less strong, ready to end the quiet. When Catherine eventually broke her quiet and stepped center stage, even Anne was taken aback by what transpired. Every royal smile is a silent battle, and Catherine had been engaged in one. While Anne officially maintained her position, Catherine was at a crossroads in her own life. Keep your composure, or, at last, speak up. She made the shocking decision to expose her innermost scars in order to preserve the truth. Catherine had always exuded calmness from the outside. In private, however, the pain was intense and enduring. It was more than just the false information Meghan disseminated. It was the weaponization of child-rearing, family, and motherhood. A specific incident that is still discussed in whispers among royal employees served as a tipping point. During a delicate moment regarding their children's royal appearances, Meghan openly suggested that Catherine had undermined her. The narrative was largely accepted, ambiguous, and emotionally intense. Catherine, however, knew it was untrue. She also had the documentation to support her claims. She started secretly gathering documents behind closed doors, memos from the staff, email chains, first-hand accounts. She never gave public speeches, never changed the press's narrative. However, she retained everything. Catherine's silence turned from grace into a burden when a well-known media site relayed Meghan's account of events. At that moment, she underwent a transformation. Meghan's accusations were immediately refuted by an email that was purportedly leaked from within her own network. In it, Meghan seemed to make fun of what Catherine had called a very intimate occasion, using icy language about the Princess of Wales that left senior aides speechless. Catherine broke at that point. She refrained from snapping. She refrained from going to the tabloids. Rather, she assembled her staff and delivered a briefing that would subsequently be characterized as one of the most poignant in royal history. "I have safeguarded this family," she declared. "However, I refuse to let my kids serve as pawns for the ambition of others." Normally calm and gentle, her voice wavered with determination rather than fear. She was unaware that her words were being recorded. Her unfiltered comment was captured by a microphone that was unintentionally left live. Although the video was never seen by the general public, it had a profound impact inside the palace. Those closest to her realized for the first time the extent of her silent pain and the fortitude she had displayed in concealing it. She and Anne started behaving in unison instead than in parallel after that. They exchanged tactics, methods, and intelligence. Their shared goal was to safeguard both the innocence of children too young to defend themselves and the dignity of the crown. It had nothing to do with retaliation. Reputations have nothing to do with it. Truth was at issue. Catherine was aware that the price of her silence had been broken trust and restless nights. Now, however, she was prepared to face the storm with Anne at her side and the evidence in hand. The palace had no option because Anne and Catherine were on the same side. It was no longer possible to conceal the lies. The moment of exposure had arrived. The altercation took place at Highgrove House, far from the cameras and the mayhem. Tension was high at a private meeting between Meghan, Anne, Catherine, and the Royal Legal Council. What started out as a reconciliation ended up being a reckoning. The invitation was well-crafted, impartial, diplomatic, and disguised in terms of peacekeeping. Meghan was informed that there will be a chance to clear up any misunderstandings during the meeting. She was unaware that Anne and Catherine were not going to allow the occasion devolve into formalities. The purpose of this was not to clear the air. It has to do with defining a boundary. As always, Anne was the first to strike. With the royal emblem sealed on the cover, she set the document on the table. A disastrous collection of inconsistencies, digital timestamps, witness statements, and internal documents may be found inside. Each of them refuted anything Meghan had said, either in public or privately. Anne slid the file forward, and the room fell silent. "These aren't miscommunications," she stated icily. "They are produced." Meghan's reaction was quick and enraged. She accused the two women of setting up a trap and using prejudiced records and pre-planned charges to put her in a difficult situation. Her loud, dramatic comments, however, simply served to emphasize what Anne and Catherine already understood. She wasn't present to accept accountability. Her purpose was to steer the narrative. Catherine refrained from yelling. She remained steadfast. She spoke from a place of pain, looking Meghan in the eye with gentle firmness. She talked on how painful it was to witness her kids being used as pawns in false public narratives. A single, compelling deception has the power to completely alter a family's history. The monarchy was more than simply a symbol, she reminded Meghan. It was a living institution with actual people, actual kids, and actual repercussions. Meghan, though, refused to give up. She maintained that she had been misled, misquoted, and misinterpreted, and that the recordings had been taken out of context, that it was she who was being attacked. Anne issued her final warning since her failure to take responsibility only served to stoke the flames. "We will act not to destroy you, but to protect what still remains unbroken," Anne said if you persisted in your denial. Despite their simplicity, the words carried a great deal of weight. Meghan snorted, but she remained silent. Rather, her lawyer, who was sitting a few feet away, finally said, the conversation changed. The tone shifted. It was now a legal issue rather than a royal one. Attorneys from both parties started describing the possible repercussions of disclosure, harm to one's reputation, and legal action. What started off as a discussion now teetered on the verge of official conflict. Despite everything, Anne and Catherine maintained their composure. They had not come to get revenge. They had come to be held accountable, and they made it obvious right there. The palace would hold Meghan accountable if they didn't already. The royal women's decision was confirmed by the encounter, but even the Prime Minister's staff was shaken by the subsequent action. The palace triggered a Level 3 Royal Emergency Protocol, an internal crisis classification meant for challenges to the legitimacy of the monarchy, for the first time in decades. Even seasoned insiders were taken aback that it was set off by Meghan's deceit. This was no longer a family issue. It was an emergency under the Constitution. Something changed when the Highgrove altercation was over. Instead of feeling relieved when they arrived to London, Anne and Catherine had such a strong sense of urgency that they disregarded all customs. It was evident from their statements and the hostile reaction they had recently encountered that this was not a scandal that needed to be suppressed. The whole basis of royal credibility was at danger, and such insight necessitated quick action. Rarely discussed and hardly ever used, the emergency protocol is intended for times of institutional or national danger, threats, assassination, war, and abdication. These are its typical triggers, but this time it was intentional, damaging, and quickly eroding public confidence in the Crown through lies. Bypassing the Privy Council and notifying the Crown's senior operational units, the procedure was initiated early in the morning with Anne's signature and Catherine's confirmation. The palace was converted into a war room in a matter of hours. Senior royals were called to a midnight meeting behind sealed doors, some of whom had not been convened with such urgency since the Queen's passing. No leaks, no media. Even employees were not permitted to stay in the room. The atmosphere within was tight. The ramifications were clear to all. The world was watching as the monarchy faced an integrity crisis. Palace communications teams were subject to stringent gag restrictions in order to avert instant disruption. Phones were seized, only secure lines. Despite speculation exploding across international headlines, there were no official pronouncements, leaks to friendly media, or public reactions. However, two voices in the background wouldn't be silenced. Truth, not complete exposure, but regulated disclosure, was the only path forward, according to Anne and Catherine. Enough to rekindle faith, enough to demonstrate the monarchy's resilience. They offered a strategy. Both women presented a well-crafted combined statement, verifying the presence of false information without identifying the sources. Preservation was the aim, not retaliation. But King Charles was hesitant. Although he was aware of the risks, he was wary due to the burden of his crown and the memories of previous disasters. He was afraid of escalation. He was afraid of legacy. Above all, he was afraid of what would happen if Meghan took revenge. His silence was paralysis rather than weakness, and a storm started to build in that void. Already furious, William delivered a warning of his own. He would make everything public if the palace did not take action within 48 hours. No delays, no filters. What his father wouldn't do, he would. For the advisors there, it was a chaotic yet controlled occasion. Everybody was making calculations. Every second mattered. Every word and action has the power to change the monarchy's destiny. The palace crafted a statement that would alter everything because they knew time was running out and the world was watching. The world held its breath as Anne and Catherine stood side by side in front of the press. This was an implicit warning, not only a declaration. The subtext was tremendous, yet their words were measured. No more deception of the monarchy. The time of quiet was past. The news conference was planned discreetly, without the customary fanfare. There were just two women, no elaborate background, no palace banners. With the weight of the institution behind them, the iron core of the crown and its emotional heartbeat are poised to speak. Live streams rolled and cameras clicked, yet neither of them recoiled. They weren't there to spread rumors. Their purpose was to mark a boundary in history, and started. Sharp and unwavering was her voice. She admitted that there have been inconsistencies in recent months, discrepancies of integrity and truth that are no longer to be disregarded. Meghan was not mentioned by her. She didn't have to. Each word was carefully chosen to get right to the point without becoming ostentatious. Then, the sentence that would make headlines all over the world appeared. Personal story must always yield to royal duty. It was diplomacy wrapped around a dagger. Everyone was aware of its target. Catherine then moved forward. She spoke in a softer but no less authoritative tone. Her message was maternal, not merely institutional. As a mother, she remarked, taking a moment to catch her breath, when harmful deception threatens the next generation, I cannot remain silent. The truth cannot be compromised. Better is what our kids deserve. Her words carried pain, power, and suffering. The entire planet sensed it. The press blew up in a matter of minutes. The statement was deemed unprecedented by royal commentators. Within an hour, hashtags were trending all around the world on social media. The connotation was obvious even if neither Anne nor Catherine gave names. And the royal women had seized charge of the story for the first time in the public domain, not by retaliation, but by telling the truth. Measured. Unquestionably, Meghan's staff worked feverishly behind the scenes. They were unprepared for the timing. A third-party spokesman produced a well-crafted reaction within hours, alleging selective narrative and dissatisfaction. However, the impact was not as great as it was supposed to be. The public noted that the tone was defensive and reactive. Polls changed nearly immediately. The public's support for Anne and Catherine abruptly changed after waning in the previous years. Particularly after so many months of turmoil, their dignity, self-control, and choice to talk without spectacles struck a chord. The monarchy was not the only thing the statement had done. It had served as a reminder of its previous values. However, the triumph was not complete. It was also far from definitive, because Meghan wasn't done, even if Anne and Catherine had had a conversation with royal authority. In actuality, she was planning her next move even as the statement reverberated across television panels and news cycles. The tempest had only just started, though, for everyone was caught off guard by Meghan's subsequent actions. Meghan threatened back just when the royal family believed they were back in charge. A mysterious message sent by an unidentified source alluded to a treasure trove of information that might destroy more than just reputations. Meghan was not going to back down, even when the monarchy had drawn first blood. It wasn't a coincidence. Just 24 hours after Anne and Catherine's historic declaration stunned the world, an odd leak appeared online. It came from a platform that was well known for its whistleblower information, but it was obviously intentional. No names were mentioned in the post. It was not need to. Rather, it asserted that a royal associate had unpublished recordings, internal correspondence, and records that, if made public, would permanently change the monarchy's reputation. The connotation was surgical, but the wording was ambiguous. This was not a public message. The palace was the direct target of the warning shot. Meghan's legal team issued a more official but similarly ambiguous statement almost immediately after. Citing improper cooperation inside royal channels and defamatory connotations, they maintained the right to pursue all appropriate legal options. However, their last line caught people's attention. If more provocation takes place, more proof might be made public. Someone had lighted the fuse. Social media was ablaze with rumors. Was Meghan getting ready for another interview in the vein of Oprah? Was there any video? Voicemails? She allegedly secretly recorded important talks at Windsor, according to some. Others thought that during her last days in the UK, she had kept text messages with palace officials. There was a flurry of theories. In a matter of hours, hashtags criticizing the palace's lack of transparency and urging Meghan to speak up once more went viral. The atmosphere inside the palace changed from one of victory to one of suspense. The quick counterpunch caught King Charles off guard, so he convened another emergency meeting. Advisors discussed what to do next: add a legal reply to escalate, could stay put and decline to participate. However, Charles had arrived at his threshold. It was too much to handle the thought of another public conflict, one that might entail courtrooms, discovery, and international disgrace. However, Anne was unaffected. Permit her. According to reports, she told senior staff, we have spoken the truth. The remainder is noise. Catherine said the same thing. This isn't about controlling fallout, it's about standing firm, she said in private to her team. Their determination sent a strong statement to the organization. They had had enough of being afraid. However, the monarchy was not gullible. They realized that the game's regulations had altered. There were repercussions for every message, leak, and whisper. They also needed to ready themselves this time if Meghan actually had material that could wind the crown deeper than before, without delay or hesitation. In the meanwhile, royal planners started getting ready for another possible media attack. Statements of backup were prepared. We consulted outside public relations agencies. Additionally, reputational defense backup measures were discreetly initiated. One thing the family had learned from the past was that Meghan's revenge would not be subtle or brief. They had reset the chessboard. However, right now, the stakes had never been higher. The battle for the legitimacy of the crown is far from over. It's just getting started. I appreciate you watching. Remember to subscribe and like, and we'll see you in the next one.